Okay, today we want to talk about the background and causes of the French Revolution. Those things that influenced the outbreak of the revolution and those things that we can see as direct events and or direct causes of the revolution itself. The actual grievances of the people, the mistakes that were made by the monarchy, the inability of the nobility and the clergy to work together to maintain the status quo. Now, it's not entirely difficult to recognize the causes or the forces that are going to influence the French Revolution. And there are four basic reasons that the revolution breaks out that you need to be aware of. The first would be the American Revolution. The second would be the influence of the Enlightenment. The third would be the obsolete political and social structures that existed in France at the time. And the fourth would be the economic and agrarian crises that were sweeping across France and affecting most of the people in the Third Estate. Now, while it often gets overlooked, it's difficult to not see the influence that the French involvement in our revolution here in America had upon the eventual outbreak of revolution in France. Um, you know, this picture here by Jonathan Trumbull showing the surrender of Lord Cornwallis's troops at Yorktown, you can see that French troops are prominently featured on the left. And in fact, there were 15,000 French troops, allies, that were sent to North America to help us win our war for independence. And when these troops got back home to France and were dispersed into the general population, then of course they're going to bring tales of things they have seen, the ideas that they have witnessed in action. So, in that sense, it's a transfer of ideas across the Atlantic Ocean. Another thing that's going to contribute to the French Revolution is about 50% of the French national debt had been incurred in loans and money, materials, and things like that that had been sent to America to aid us in our revolution. So, while it might have been in their benefit to compete with Britain as a world power, it also greatly increased the national debt, which was going to put a burden upon the tax-paying classes of France. Now, another influence upon the outbreak of revolution, of course, is the Enlightenment. People like Voltaire and Descartes and Rousseau, who were critical of traditional government institutions, critics of absolute monarchy. Obviously their writings were going to be attacking the type of government that had existed in France for some time. We can list these people as influences, but sometimes they get too much credit for actually having started the revolution. That if these guys weren't around and hadn't been writing, well, then everything would have been fine. But the printing press was fairly well established. There was a tradition in France of political criticism. Even when things were censored, things were printed and passed around at coffee houses and on street corners. So, even though officially you might not get something printed, it wasn't difficult to obtain what was considered controversial literature. Okay, at this time I want you to pause the video and answer the following question. In what ways did the French participation in the American Revolution in part cause the French Revolution? So what were the factors from our revolution that helped lead to the French Revolution? After you've done that, you can go on. Now, another problem for France was an extremely obsolete political and social structure. Now, technically speaking, there was a legislature or an advisory body of sorts known as the Estates General. But this could be called only by the king and had not been called since 1614. So 1614, 1789, this was not something that the king took advantage of on a regular basis. And your place in society was regulated by the estate at which you were ranked. So the clergy, okay, the first estate, about 5% of the population, the priests, the bishops, the cardinals, were all part of the first estate. The nobility, which were probably anywhere from 10 to 15% of the population, were in the second estate, and then, as they say, the third estate was everybody else. That's a little bit misleading in that the peasants really didn't have a voice. People were selected from various towns and villages. So the third estate would have been wealthy merchants or leading citizens that were allowed to go to Paris and meet with the Estates General or were selected. But the idea that somehow there was participatory democracy and that the third estate was proportionally represented is generally incorrect. Now, by and large, France was an agrarian society. It was much further, or excuse me, less further along than, say, Britain in developing any kind of industrial base. 80% of the population was still rural and owned about 40% of the land. Now, the key distinction here would be that these are not serfs, such as in Russia, that are bound to the land. They're not slaves. Typically, they were small farmers, and they either paid rent to the lords of the manors in a sense of the old feudal system, or they were sharecroppers, where they paid 1/3 to 1/2 of their crop, when it was brought in each year, so that that's how they paid their rent instead. And unfortunately, they also paid the majority of the tax burden. One of the problems that was going on in France at this time was that inflation had increased 66% in the past 50 years, but real earning power had only increased about 20%. And so the buying power of the majority of the people is decreasing. Now, this also puts a pinch on the manorial lords who owned about 20% of the land. And generally they collected what were called banalities for the use of the mill, the wine press, the bakery. But as inflation increased, they tended to, end, I guess, what we'd call salutary neglect and start collecting taxes they hadn't collected in some time. They'd start increasing tax rates or, calling in debts from the peasants. And as they pushed harder to try and collect the dues owed to them, this led to an increased resentment by the peasants who hadn't been paying these things and were now also being pinched by their own inability to pay taxes. Now, the church owned about 10% of the land from which they rented or couldn't really be assessed because the church property wasn't itself taxed, but they did, they had cathedrals sitting on the land, and so it wasn't really open to taxation, although they did collect tithes, and there's a lot of resentment growing among the peasants too at the wealth of the church. So we get to 1789, and France is now at the verge of a financial collapse. They're in a financial crisis, and okay, how do they get to this point? Well, first of all, you get the debt from the American Revolution, which is about 50% of the national debt. Then on top of that, about 25% of the national debt is from current military expenditures. And then another 25% of the debt is maintenance of the monarchy and other civil fees that have to be paid. The problem is, with all these debts, there's not enough revenue coming in. They're in a revenue negative kind of situation to where there is more being paid out or more owed than what's coming in. A great deal of this was due to tax evasion, people who just outright didn't pay. The nobles had all kinds of exemptions and frequently were not subject to any taxes or very few. There's a lot of fraud and corruption at the local level, people skimming off the top. So, in the early 1770s, it was recognized by the French ministers of finance that, they seriously needed to address this problem. They needed to turn things around, or France was going to be in a serious financial crisis. And each one of the finance ministers that you see listed on this chart, Maupeou, Turgot, Necker, Calonne, Briand, each one of them tried to make reforms. And what they tried to do was shift some of the tax burden away from the lower classes, make sure that the nobility paid a fair portion of the tax burden. However, each one was frustrated by the Parliament of Paris specifically, and parliaments at the local level from implementing any kind of reform because the nobles didn't want to pay any more taxes than they had to. And so every time they tried to reform, then they were blocked by the nobles who were an advisory body called the Assembly of Notables to the king. So you see Maupeou was fired, Turgot was fired, Necker, who was actually Swiss, probably the most brilliant of the finance ministers, was fired. Calonne was actually exiled. Briand was fired. So there were actually honest attempts by the government to fix the problem, which were all frustrated by the nobility who didn't want to pay any more than they were already paying, which in some cases was nothing at all. So the Assembly of Notables is frustrating anything that the finance ministers are trying to do in order to reform the system. So the only thing that the king can do at this point to get any headway is to convene the Estates General for May of 1789. And of course this had never happened or had not happened since 1614. The problem being that voting had always been done by estate, which meant that the first estate, the clergy, got one vote, the nobles got one vote, and everybody else got one vote. And this hardly seemed fair to the third estate, which made up 80% of the population. But, of course, the nobles are just fine with keeping it this way because they'll always have the clergy on their side, and they'll outnumber the third estate 2-to-1, and so they can avoid any kind of real reform. This is when people like Abbé Sieyès publish essays like What is the Third Estate? And this is where he states that the third estate is everything. It's the only thing. And the third estate, which had called for voting by head, meaning each person in the assembly, they literally walked out. They found themselves locked out of the assembly, and they said, fine, we boycott, and they look around for somewhere to meet. At which point the clergy walk out and align themselves with the Third Estate, and they declare themselves the National Assembly, the rightful sovereign legislature of France. And so on June 20th of 1789, the Second Estate and the Third Estate together take the so-called tennis court oath, which said that the delegates would meet in session and they would not adjourn until they had written a new constitution for France. The idea of having a written constitution was something that they admired from, of course, our revolution in the United States, but they did not yet have. They want the guarantees. They see the example of England as well. And so, goodbye States General, hello National Assembly. So now we reach the decisive moment in this incipient revolution. And Louis XVI, the king, this is where he failed to act. And because he failed to act, the drama is going to play out to its bloody conclusion. There were 18,000 French troops at Versailles. And if, like Louis XIV, he had acted decisively, marched the French troops into Paris, opened fire on the protesters, made a bloody example of them, then perhaps this whole revolution could have been headed off. But he vacillated. He couldn't make a decision. He wanted to have the affection of his people, and in the meantime, the army has time to think about it. They start to have defections, and if he had acted early on in this crisis, whether or not it was right or wrong, that we can debate that. But the fact of the matter is he didn't act, and because he didn't act, the revolution is going to continue. So what I would like you to do at this point is to stop the video and then list the reasons that the meeting of the Estates General collapsed and the National Assembly was formed. So why did the Estates General collapse, and how did this lead to the formation of the National Assembly? Hope you've enjoyed your first video lecture, and we'll try this again in the future.